You're listening to A Family History of, the podcast where we explore major moments of Britain and Ireland's past through the eyes of the families who lived them. I'm Jen Baldwin, research specialist at Find My Past, and I get to spend my life exploring the archives to reveal the remarkable stories of everyday people. In this series, we're stepping into a world shaped by conflict. Across 3 episodes, we'll follow one woman's life from birth in a city on the brink of war, through love and secrecy in the chaos of the Blitz, and into the quiet resilience that carried her through loss. Her name was Edna Bourne. She was born in Birmingham in the industrial English Midlands in April 1911, just days after the census takers closed their ledgers. Her childhood unfolded amidst the smoke of metalworking and motor factories as Britain braced for conflict. In Part 1, Born into a World at War, we'll uncover what it was like to grow up in a city-turned-munitions hub during the First World War. How did rationing, fear, and civic duty shape women's lives? And how can we uncover the details of their experiences in a world recorded by men? Welcome to A Family History of Wartime Women.
Dugdale Street, Birmingham, April 1911. Smoke drifts above the rooftops, curling grey ribbons against a pale spring sky. The air tastes of coal dust and iron filings, sharp, metallic, clinging to every breath. A tram rattles past, sparks flickering beneath its wheels. On the pavement, boots scuff and heels click. Voices rise in quick bursts, factory girls laughing, a newsboy calling headlines of mounting unrest in Europe. Inside a narrow terraced house with windows filmed with soot, a kettle hisses softly on the range. Upstairs, the cry of a newborn pierces the still air. Edna Bourne has arrived, her tiny fists clenched tight, eyes blinking into the light of the lamps, unaware of the world around her, bracing itself for conflict. Beyond the door, life's daily rhythms tick along. Men trudge to the foundry, women queue for bread, and somewhere in the distance, church bells toll. No one knows it yet, but this child's first breath is drawn in a city on the edge of transformation. Birmingham will soon feed the machinery of war.
When you open the 1911 census of England and Wales on Find My Past and search through the millions of possible addresses across the country, you can find Dugdale Street, Birmingham. You find the details of 89 households neatly recorded in handwritten ink. And there, at number 17, the Bourne family is living in a modest terrace in the heart of the city. Edna Bourne isn't listed yet. She enters the world on the 12th of April, 1911, just 10 days after the census is completed on April 2nd. But her parents are there, of course, Thomas and Lucy Bourne. Thomas, a lathe fitter, is a skilled worker. He keeps the industrial machines of the nearby factories and workshops operating with precision. Lucy, like millions of other married women, has no occupation listed, just a blank space. There's an older sister, Doris, already in the home. It's a snapshot of working class life on the eve of seismic change. Although she doesn't appear on the census return, Edna is at the center of this story, a child born into a world lurching towards war. And to explore this story further, I'm joined by a very special guest, historian, author, and curator Lucy Worsley, who also just happens to be Edna's granddaughter. Lucy, welcome to A Family History of. It's such a privilege to have you here as our first guest.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here, Jen. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a remarkable story in a number of ways, but of course to you especially, because this is the life of your grandmother. You brought this story to us to explore it, and I'm curious, why did you choose Edna's story?
Well, of course, I wanted to choose a woman's story. That's been something I've been interested in for my whole career. I really like the stories of people who aren't important in their lifetimes. It's nice to remember and honor them, I suppose. And in this case, Edna Bourne to me was just Granny. And she always really spoiled me and my brother. She was very, very kind to us. We used to do things like watching television together, quite ordinary things. I particularly remember her having a a very luxurious white sheepskin rug in her
Oh.
bedroom. Her home always seemed warmer and cozier and kind of naughtier than ours because she would let us watch television and that sort of thing. So I'd really like to know more about who she was in her younger life before she became our granny.
Yeah, it's such an important component of understanding a woman's whole lifespan, right? Is that moment before the role is assigned, if you will. So we started with that wonderful narrative at her birth in Birmingham, and it's can't help but think it's almost a bitter irony when we talk about researching women in history. We often lament that women are left out of the documented records. But here we are, starting with the fact that your grandmother was born just a few days after the 1911 census is taken, and thus, of course, not included in that very important record.
Don't you must love this too, Jen. When a new census comes out, it's just thrilling for historians, and we love it when censuses get released 100 years
Absolutely.
on. It's not a thrill that we're going to have for a while because the 1931 census got damaged in the Second World War, so there's a bit of a gap there.
Yeah, and the 1941 census was never taken because of the war, so we all have to wait until the 1951 census comes out. But you're right, it's an incredibly exciting moment for everybody, I think, across history and family history when a census is released. So tell us a little bit, of course, this is a world on the brink of change. There's a lot of things going on in this period, and we can look back as historians and go, "Well, yeah, they're just a few years away from the war," but can you tell us a little bit, maybe try to describe what 1911 really looks like?
Well, like you say, the war's only 3 and a bit years away, but I'm not sure how much the people living in Dugdale Street would really have been aware of that. And in fact, Birmingham is going to be at the centre of Britain's war effort in the First World War. One thing that's connected to the 1911 census, the taking of it was disrupted because some people
Sure.
who were suffragettes refused to give their details to make a point that they didn't feel that they were being treated properly as citizens by society. And there were strikes going on in this very industrial city. There was strikes amongst the railway workers and in the metal industries, which is super important in Birmingham. In 1911, the anchor for the Titanic was being forged. That's a connection with the year that my
Oh,
grandmother was born.
that's actually really fascinating. It hadn't occurred to me at all. All right, so as we kind of work our way through this period of history and kind of explore this era where Edna comes into the world, let's get into a little bit more detail and talk about Edna's life in particular. So she's baptized at Christ Church in the parish of Summerfield, which is in North Edgbaston, slightly confusingly a suburb in southwest Birmingham. So when you place that register into its context, it reveals so much more than just a religious milestone. It really anchors the family in a neighborhood that is soon going to be deeply involved in wartime efforts, fundraising, parish organized charity drives, and so much more.
Well, I was fascinated, Jen, by the map that you sent me of Dugdale Street, where the family were living. And if you look at it, you can see that this is a really dense community.
Mm,
The street is mainly terraced, but there are parts of the street where they've got what are called back to backs.
yeah.
In fact, if you go to Birmingham, you can visit some back to back houses that are run by the National Trust today. And these are kind of worse than terrace houses because two terraces are stuck together. So they're single aspect dwellings. There are no windows in the back wall because somebody else's house is there. So you enter through a court at the front where the washing was hung. And there are little buildings in the courtyard where the loos were and where people did the washing. And then there's the houses themselves that were usually very, very packed full of people. And she was born at home, I understand, as most people were then. And the other thing that's really noticeable on the map is the very industrial setting of the street. Close by, you can see there's the Atlas Aluminium Works, there's the Patent Brass Tube Works, and there's the Cape Copper Works. And you've already said that my great-grandfather, Thomas Bourne, was a skilled metal worker. I'm guessing he worked at one of these establishments.
Yeah, most likely. And my colleagues and peers will be smiling as they listen to this because maps are fantastic. We need more maps in our lives. We can see all of this through the documentary evidence, the maps that you've already talked about, but we can also see it through contemporary newspapers. So we took a bit of time to review newspapers from this area, specifically through about 1912 to 1914, just in the first couple of years of Edna's life. And we find notices that already kind of speak to the industrial environment in which we find the family, but also kind of looking forward a little bit into the war years. So as you start to examine the newspapers, you see notices for saving schemes, food economy campaigns, kind of speaking to that environment of the back to backs that you called out there. And so there's also kind of these early rumblings about the rising prices of real staples, right, like coal and bread. So we take these pieces from the newspapers. They're not abstract headlines, really. This is the environment that Edna's born into. People are really struggling to make ends meet.
I'm guessing that Thomas is lucky in this community because he's got a job. He's got a good job. I tried to find out exactly what a lathe fitter is, which without total success. I understand it's someone who works a machine that makes intricate components for other machines. At other times in other records, he's described as a general engineer's turner, an engineer fitter, and later on as a tool maker. He seems to have a lot of different jobs. He doesn't seem to have trouble getting employed. And I'm assuming, Jen, I don't know if I'm right about this, that it's likely that his tube factory is going to get involved in the war effort, as many factories were getting turned over to making warships and aircrafts and vehicles. In fact, the first tanks were made in Birmingham, I
There you
understand.
go. Yeah, you're exactly right, actually. So lathe fitter in 1911 was considered skilled work. As you already mentioned, Birmingham's metalworks feed directly into munitions production, and the shift, of course, intensifies really quickly after August 1914. So here we've got Edna. Her father's in this trade that kind of places the family right at the heart of Britain's wartime industrial engine. There's a lot going on already. So when we put
Mm.
all of these records together, right, the census, the baptism, the newspapers, they really tell us about Edna's earliest memories, even though she herself isn't explicitly described in the documents at all.
This was a period when things were getting better for workers. And I was quite interested to read when I was getting ready to talk to you that this was the period when unemployment starts to get defined, not as an individual moral failing, but as a sort of structural problem with society. And the Liberal government from 1906 were introducing things to help, like free school meals and old age pensions and unemployment benefits for some people in some industries. But like we've established, Thomas Bourne doesn't seem to have needed this. And Lucy Bourne, his wife, always seems to have worked within the home rather than having to go out to supplement the household income.
Yeah, absolutely. This is also a period where childhood is changing significantly, right? The laws around education have changed. So you can assume that the two young girls are going to enter the school and stay for several years compared to generations before where they left quite early. Newspapers are much more prolific at this point compared to the previous generation. The news is at hand and readily available. Global news is coming. So all of the conflict that's happening in Europe that leads up to the First World War is household, conversation, right? Just like it would be today. So there's this normalization of um, understanding what's happening across the world, understanding that conflict, bringing it into the home. And I do kind of wonder what Edna and her sister might have been exposed to through even just regular dinner time conversation about global conflict and war, and whether as very young children that would have impacted them.
I can tell you that the life of another woman whose lifespan overlaps my grandmother's, who I actually know a lot more about. This is the famous writer Agatha Christie.
Mm.
She was uh, taken completely by surprise when war broke out in 1914. She said, "Oh, I'd heard people talking about it, but I didn't think it was going to actually happen."
So there's an absence in records that we've kind of already skirted around a bit. This is really at the heart of this part of Edna's story, right? The records don't give us her voice. She's obviously too young, but they do give us the changing world that she lived in, the pressure shaping her parents' decisions, and the neighborhood networks around her as a child.
July 1916. The war is no longer a headline, but the backdrop of daily life. 5-year-old Edna leaves her narrow terrace beside her father, Thomas, her small boots tapping the cobbles as coal smoke hangs in the grey air. At the corner, he joins the stream of men heading to the munitions works, offering her a quick smile before disappearing in the noise. Edna's walk to school is short. Soot-blackened railings, ration notices snapping in the breeze, stark reminders of shortages. School is steady, and the warm midday meal, bean soup, bread, maybe a little pudding, is the best she'll have all day. Around her, children chatter about games and exchange Zeppelin rumours. In the afternoon, Edna returns home to find her mother Lucy stretching scant ingredients into supper. As factory whistles echo at dusk, they watch lamplight spill across the cobbles, waiting for Thomas to come home. Every small moment is coloured by war, rumbling stomachs, quiet sacrifices, and a world growing more uncertain.
Okay, so here we are. War has arrived. And it's important, I think, to pause for a second and contextualize that Edna is just 3 years old when this all kicks off. So her earliest memories must have come from this period.
Yes, you're right, because between the ages of 3 and 7, Britain was at war. She probably was quite surprised when she was 8 and Britain wasn't at war anymore.
Definitely. I think it's a really formative time, right, as a child. So we can look back in the records to help build a picture of the world around her at this time, like we have been doing. And one way to add kind of some ideas about this is to look at school records. They add a bit of a fascinating layer. So there are
Mm.
attendance books that are available from this era that note absences during air raid drills or days lost to malnutrition related illness. It's kind of a reminder, I suppose, that war touched even the most ordinary routines, even for children as young as Edna at this point.
I suppose in the newspaper records that you sent to me, the scarcity of food really stood out as a theme. And I think a lot of people would think of rationing, that's a World War II thing, but it came in 1918, towards the end of the First World War
Yeah.
II. I was interested to read that the request for free school breakfasts doubled between 1913 and 1914, perhaps because of some fathers starting to disappear from family life and go off to the front and creating financial pressures. And also in 1914, you can read that the Birmingham Education Committee are thinking about what's going to happen to needy members of the population in times of war and are thinking of opening dinner centres. You could, in Edna's own neighbourhood, you get a free tea if you needed it at the Wesleyan Poor Children's Mission. But I'm not sure that Edna herself would ever have needed that because her father was at home and he was working, as far
Yeah.
as we know.
Yeah, I think all of those examples are really poignant in terms of kind of, again, just describing this environment and the reality of resources, right? So when we think about how to do this for ourselves as family historians or people interested in this period of time, one of the ways that we can do this is by turning to the local press, right? It's an incredibly rich resource for this period. One of the things that I found quite interesting, especially in the Birmingham papers, was the air raid precautions, which is again is something we don't really think about in World War One, right? We hear about the Blitz, of course, but we don't hear about the World War One air attacks. But they did exist. There's actually a Zeppelin raid on the 31st of January 1916, and that's when you really see the increase in notices about air raid precautions in Birmingham papers.
I
And
have
it,
been down such a Zeppelin rabbit hole since starting to think about this. I've become obsessed with this raid. I didn't know about it at all. Like you said, I really thought of bombing raids as being part of World War II, not
Yeah,
World War One. But this fleet of Zeppelins you mentioned in 1918, it was supposed to be going to Liverpool, but it got lost in the fog.
right.
And these are massive things, as long as a jumbo jet. They must have been terrifying if you'd been able to see them through the fog.
Yeah.
And they bombed a lot of places in the Midlands, like Walsall and Burton-on-Trent and Loughborough, and about 70 people died in those raids in the Midlands in World War One from the
Right.
skies. It's extraordinary. But whether Edna's family would have known about it is a moot question, because like you say, the wartime censor really clamped down on this raid. They didn't want people to know about it in case it freaked them out too much.
Yeah, and it would have, right? I mean, I can't really imagine for the first time ever, really, in the history of warfare, seeing weapons fall from the sky. Right?
Mm,
That
mm.
is and on civilians, no less. That it's a really striking moment in history. Birmingham newspapers are particularly substantial, but there is very clear evidence of food shortages and ration guidance. Again, not instilled ration structure just yet, right? As you say, they didn't apply that until 1918, but there's notices around the lack of sugar and bread. There are coal restrictions because industrial demand is outpacing supply. There are appeals for war saving certificates. So these newspapers really give us a lot of that color. And you referenced it earlier too. You talked about class. There's a great example actually from the Birmingham Daily Gazette. They're actually reporting on a conference, and it's the Birmingham and District Skilled Engineering Trade Unions Federation, which is a lovely mouthful of a name. They represent 30,000 skilled workmen, and they publish the resolution that they come to from the conference. They publish that in the paper. So I'm just going to read a little snippet of that to because it really showcases that class question. So the quote is, while the wives and children of the industrial classes are compelled to stand in long queues on the remote chance of ultimately obtaining a limited supply, we are struck by the marked absence from the queues of the wives and children of the employing classes. They talk a great deal about this issue of class at this particular conference, and it's something that comes up again over and over again in the newspapers. So, to put that into some perspective, it's entirely possible that Edna's father, of course, your great grandfather, would have been a member of one of these workers' unions or one of these organizations. So, that pressure on the government with civic, even domestic matters, are kind of even threatening to strike over this inequality and the need for food. The government does eventually concede to the unions over these points, and as you mentioned earlier, the distribution of rations was kind of stabilized finally in 1918. So it takes a couple of years, but they do get there.
And I'm imagining Edna's mother has, well, she always had a lot of responsibility to make
Mm.
money go as far as it could, but even more so with the difficulties of finding food and adapting to shortages.
Yeah, it's really clear from the newspapers that that was a problem. Okay, so civic records, like we've been talking about, help us understand the roles that women like Lucy, Edna's mother, were taking on during the war. Especially when the formal records don't really capture their domestic labor directly, right? This is the question of silent labor, of course, from women.
Yes, which to this day is not counted in gross domestic product,
Mm.
astonishingly.
There's, significant moments in the history of women, right? In this period, we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, and this is a story that's pretty well known. We hear about the suffrage movement, for example, and we hear about women in the workforce in World War One, and it really kinda changes everything in the interwar period that they're gonna move into, and certainly into World War II.
It does strike me that Edna's big sister Doris, by 1921, has a job. After the war, a lot of women were used to working outside the home and went on doing it. And in the case of Doris, Edna's big sister, she was a clerk as well, which is it's a it's not a manual job. It's a job that's indoors. Um, I think that this is quite a lucky family who've lived through World
Mm.
War One without anybody in the close family being away or lost through fighting. It seems like things are going quite well for them.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, just the idea that they're one of the few families really across the country that doesn't have, someone even in the war effort immediately in the Army, Navy services. They are just at home together through this entire experience.
Autumn 1918. The war is grinding towards its end, yet its shadow stretches across every street. 7-year-old Edna stands on Witten Lane, beneath the looming gates of Aston Villa's football ground. A sudden cheer erupts inside, brief, sharp, rolling over the red brick terraces. For a moment, despite depleted teams and a suspended league, it feels like life before ration books and sirens. But reminders of war lie everywhere. Posters peel from lampposts. Save wheat and help the fleet. Eat less bread. A soldier limps past, sleeve pinned where an arm once was. A woman follows, steadying a basket of coal slack, apron smudged from the morning fire. Smoke from the foundries mixes with the scent of damp earth. Around Edna, voices talk of victory and loss on the football field and the front. Yet life presses on. The whistle blows, the crowd roars, and for a fleeting second, hope rises louder than fear.
Right, so we've just stood on Witten Lane, got a picture of where the Bournes now live. It's the autumn of 1918. You can almost hear for yourself the noise of the football ground in the city that's still very much marked by war. So when we step back into the records and that wider historical context that we've been talking about, Birmingham at the end of the First World War looks very different from the city Edna was born into just 7 years earlier.
Yes, by this point, Birmingham has become completely focused on producing war materials. And I should tell you, Jen, that the family absolutely will go on supporting Aston Villa. My own mother, in the next 2 generations down, had a season ticket and supports
Mm.
them to this day.
I have to admit, I'm a Tottenham fan, so.
Oh, well, in that case, our conversation's over now.
But when we talk about Birmingham in 1918, that industrial output really shows us how deeply the war reshapes everyday life.
Yeah, I've got some astonishing statistics here. The Birmingham Small Arms Company, for example, before the war, it produced 135 rifles a week. But by 1918, it was making 10,000 rifles a week. That's an extraordinary growth, isn't it? You can see how things massively ramped up. And some of the factories involved were using women too. There was Austin Motors in the southwest of the city. In 1914, it employed 2,800 women. But by 1918, it was 20,000. And I love this word for women who were involved in making the munitions in World War I. They were called the munitionettes. The
Yeah,
munitionettes.
that's great. So they're not limited to factories, though, even though that's kind of the focus that we've been on. Families like the Bournes, we know they had to adapt. We know they're under significant stress, even though they don't have anyone immediately in the war, at least on the front, right? Um, so again, I have to think about as Edna's granddaughter, but combined with your levels of expertise as a historian, how do you reflect on everything they had to manage during this period?
They seem to be navigating it pretty well. In 1916, so in the middle of the war, they move to Witten Lane by the football ground, and their house there is described as having gardens and outbuildings at the rear. And like we've already said, Edna's sister Doris gets work as a clerk, a white collar job, at a company called Yates, which, as far as I've been able to work out, is an edged tool maker. So sort of in the family business, but in the back office rather than on the shop floor.
Yeah.
And in their new house, by 1921 at least, they've got 3 boarders living with them. And when I read that, I started to worry about overcrowding, because I've looked at pictures of the houses on Witten Lane and they are substantial. I don't think that people were absolutely crammed in like sardines in this house. And then something very significant, by 1921, they've got a servant. So they really are now
Yeah.
the respectable upper working classes, to have somebody working for them in their house. That was a super important mark of gentility.
Yeah, absolutely, and it changes the story a little bit, especially in relation to Lucy, right, Edna's mother, um, and just to look at her really quickly because, she never like so many women, we didn't find her in a factory employment register or as a local home front volunteer. We didn't find her in any of that kind of documentation as far as we can tell. The story for her remains pretty consistent. But the environment around her is changing really rapidly. And Edna, as a young girl, kind of looking up to her mother, would have seen that. And there's also, of course, this public expectation of women's labor, which is both paid and unpaid. And that's shifting as well in real time. So, again, that interpretation of the impact of these shifting roles on women like Lucy, right? This period reveals, again, that invisible labor inside these working class households during the war.
Mm. And the fact that women were going out to work is a reminder that history isn't just about the battles and the treaties and the
Yeah.
deeds of great men. It's about revolutions happening in kitchens.
In kitchens, yes, absolutely. There's a lot of fundraising and volunteer work that's going on. There's a lot of charities that are taking place, right? Early indicators of kind of all of this social change leading into the interwar years and eventually into these World War II roles. So here's this little girl that we picture in this kind of smoky industrial city, and yet we're seeing the foundations of this social shift, one that's going to ripple through her adult life and the lives of her daughters and granddaughters. Edna lived her childhood years amidst smoke and sirens in a city where ration notices were displayed in shop windows and searchlights sweep the sky to defend against silent Zeppelin raids. We've talked about census returns and birth records and newspaper details that have really revealed what these experiences must have been like for her and the Bourne family. But of course, this is only the beginning. The piece brings its own upheaval. For Edna, growing up in the aftermath means stepping into a new decade of change, work, love, and a couple of secrets that will ripple through generations. In part two of A Family History of Wartime Women, we follow her into the chaos of another global conflict and the constant terror of the Birmingham Blitz through a marriage shrouded in secrecy and choices made under the weight of bombs.
I just can't wait to see where my grandmother's story will take us next.
If you've enjoyed this first episode, please review us and hit subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss what happens next. You can also follow us on social media at A Family History Of, or follow me at Jen Baldwin Genealogy for more A Family History Of content. If you'd like to delve into the records and newspapers we've chatted about today, visit findmypast.co.uk/A Family History Of, where you can explore our curated collection and perhaps be inspired to discover your own family's past. We'll see you next time.